Now that we've heard from the Nuclear Waste Management Organization and Natural Resources Canada, it's time to hear about the public's perspective. What matters to them? What do they think about radioactive waste management? This is a really important aspect of this project. And so to share insights into the public perspectives, I'd like to welcome Pat Beauchamp. Pat is Vice President of Research and Analytics at Hill & Knowlton Strategies, and he's going to share some insight of some recent research that was commissioned by the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. We will be posting a summary of Pat's report on the Integrated Strategy for Radioactive Waste website at radwasteplanning.ca. There you'll find more information about the research that was conducted, more than he can cover in his presentation. So we invite you to sign up for updates so that you will be alerted when the report is posted, which should be sometime in April. There will be questions and answers at the end of this session, so please use the Engage button on your panel or submit some comments in the general chat. Over to you, Pat.
I'm Pat Beauchamp. I'm with Hill & Knowlton Strategies. So good morning. It's great to be with you today. I've been looking forward to sharing the results of our survey for a while now. So I'm going to take about 25, maybe 30 minutes to do that, and then we'll have some questions and maybe a bit of discussion. So we did a survey of around 1,600 Canadians from across the country. I want to start by highlighting at a high level the essence of what we learned. So first off, five things. We note that there's a lot of common ground generally, but especially around potential guiding principles. Now, notwithstanding the fact that there's quite a bit of common ground, there are some differences in views in how people view the merits of potential strategy approaches, so more specific issues. So for example, things like whether it's best to adopt a centralized approach to long-term waste management based on having just one or a few facilities versus having several facilities close to where radioactive waste is produced, so that we can have some differences there. To use an analogy, people can agree about where we want to go, where we should be going, but they have differences of views about what is the best way to get there. In other words, what is the safest approach for them? People have opinions because we've asked them for their opinions, but they're also quite pragmatic and open in their consideration of the issue. So this survey has a lot of qualitative data in it. So we asked a lot of open-ended questions. So for example, after we asked people to provide their opinions, we gave them an opportunity to say, well, why do you feel that way? What is the rationale? And then from that, we can see, for example, that often people were prefacing their comments with things along the lines of, depending on what the science shows or what the experts think, or I could be convinced otherwise. So there's some openness, there's some flexibility there. Similarly, while Canadians are happy to provide their views, they hope and expect that the strategy and its implementation will be guided by science and expertise first and foremost. So in some of the comments, people would say, I'm glad you're asking me about this. I'm glad to be part of the survey, in part because I didn't know about any of this, and this seems pretty important, but I hope you're going to listen to the experts. You're not just going to rely on a survey. And then we talked about implementation issues, or we got people's views on some implementation issues there. And the essence here is that people are looking for an ultimate or an optimal division of labor between the players, so waste owners and government. So in the eyes of the public, waste owners have the technical and scientific know-how, the experience, the track record for actually managing the waste, while the role of government is seen more about monitoring, ensuring transparency, accountability, and basically safeguarding the public interest. So that is the essence of it. Let's just go over some of the objectives and a bit about the methodology. So the what and the why. The point to make here is that this research represents an initial foray, a starting point, something to build upon. And while we did ask people to weigh in on some specific options, for example, whether we should continue with the status quo or have a more permanent approach, centralized versus decentralized and about implementation. The point of that really was to see how people were thinking about the issues, what values they have, what principles they have, and what considerations they feel are important. So basically to see how the wheels turn in people's heads. So that was really the point. When we did this fairly recently, so January, February, the sample, you're probably thinking 1625 is a bit of an unusual sample size, and you're right about that. And the reason for that is because we oversampled in certain areas. So in Northern Ontario, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick, we oversampled because we thought that the issues might be more salient in those areas, and because there's a smaller population there, we had to oversample in order to be able to see if there are any meaningful differences there and across the country. Turns out that they're not. Views are pretty consistent across the country. The survey was administered online, so it's self-administered. People responded to it online. This isn't something you could do over the phone anyway. Our approach, I just want to highlight a couple of things because the approach is, I wouldn't say it's unusual, but it's a little bit different. So first of all, we used a probability-based panel. So we worked with Ecos Research. With that, we used their panel, which is called Probit. And the difference between a probability-based panel and an opt-in panel, which is most panels in Canada, almost all except for the Ecos panel, is an opt-in panel. So what that means is that the panel builders get people where they can. So they advertise on social media, they buy lists, people opt into it. A probability-based panel is recruited by phone. And because pretty much everyone has access to a phone, cell, and landline, everyone in your target audience, which in this case is people, adults who live in Canada, have an equal probability of being asked to be in the panel. That's the difference, and essentially the probability-based panel is more methodologically robust. A couple of other points to make. The survey, we call this a deliberative survey. So what does that mean? So deliberative as in deliberation, as in jury, as in something to think about. So we provided people with some information. It would be pretty hard to do this type of survey without giving people some information because it isn't something that they're familiar with. It's not like the healthcare system. It's not like property taxes. They don't know much about this, if at all. So for the first 10, 12 minutes of the survey, we had some fact-based information, including 3 videos, which allowed us to cover a lot of ground. And these are the issues that we provided information on. So what is the difference between the different levels of radioactive waste, current management approaches, how people deal with this in other countries, and then looking forward, what might some of the major options be for long-term management. So let's look at some findings. If you've ever wondered what sort of questions people might have after absorbing 10, 12 minutes of information about the long-term management of radioactive waste, you're in luck because we've got that here. So before people started giving us more specific feedback about principles and options, the first question they got was an open-ended question, which we have a lot of. We had about 7 open-ended questions. And the first one was, okay, what questions do you have about this? And here are the main ones. There are others, for example, citing, where would you put this? These facilities, but these are the main ones. Of course, safety is at the top, and there's always 3 aspects when people talk about safety. There's how is it safe now? How will it be safe in the future? And how do you know? What guarantees do you have? Like, have people done this before? How can I be reassured? Transportation. There were quite a few questions about transportation. We didn't include a lot of information at all about transportation in the fact-based information. We mentioned it because some of it might have to be transported depending on which option you were to pick, but we didn't get into detail about the how. So because transportation is a key consideration, we'll see. People had questions about sort of the specifics, and these are quotes on the right-hand side. So for transportation is, how are you going to do it? Is this going to be in barrels or some kind of containers? And just people don't want to see a cloud of radioactive dust billowing from a transport truck. So left to their own imagination, this is the kind of things that people are going to wonder about. Alternatives is about can anything else be done? Is anyone working on this? Is it possible that in 20 years, 25 years, if at all, that there could be another way of dealing with this? So there's questions about that. And then because of what we're talking about, this set of issues begs the question about the future. What is the future of nuclear technology? What are we planning? And as part of that, people want to know sort of how big is the problem? Like how big, as this quote would say, is the waste pile going to get? Are we going to keep adding to it? Is this something that we're not going to have to keep adding to it in 50 years and so on? So they're trying to get a sense of the scale of the problem and what the future holds. So now we start getting into the nitty-gritty, as it were, starting with some guiding principles. So the second question people got after that first open-ended question is they were presented with this set of 11 potential principles for guiding the development of Canada's strategy for low and intermediate level waste. Now these, so you've got your principles on the left-hand side. They've been abbreviated because I wanted to fit them all on one slide, but you have the essence of it there, and I think you'll be working with these in an afternoon session. So you've got the principles on that side. On the right side, you've got the responses. So we use the 7-point scale throughout, and what I'm showing you here, you can see at the bottom, is the 7, the 6, and the 5 on the 7-point scale. What you don't see is the 1, 2, 3, and the 4, which were relatively small. And you don't see the don't know. So on the furthest right, this column is the 5, 6, and 7 added up. So total importance. So also, I should mention where these principles sort of came from. They were inspired by some of the work that NWMO's done over the years, engaging with Canadians and Indigenous peoples, but the long-term management of used fuel. So they've been working with Canadians on similar sort of things. So we drew inspiration from that. So that's where these come from. In terms of results, I just want to talk about 3 things. So first of all, you see that the percentage of the importance scores range from 66 to 97. So essentially, people thought that these were important. We can say that they resonate. I've done this sort of stuff before. The scores aren't always that high. So that's a good sign. It looks like we have some solid things to work with. Now, notwithstanding the fact that they all pretty much resonate, there is a sort of a hierarchy there, especially if we look at the 7th point. So the dark blue ranging from 82, rating it 7 out of 7 importance, all the way down to 25. So at the top, like a first tier, you've got the environment, you've got safety as the overarching principle, meeting or exceeding regulatory requirements, using the best available knowledge, security. Security mainly for people is terrorism. And then at the bottom, we've got 2 there, which are implementing things in a fiscally responsible way. So the idea of finances is less important. That's not surprising, and it's consistent with other research. It doesn't mean that it's not at all important, but it's relatively less important. Same with making use of existing projects. The other thing that I want to mention, which is not on here, is the don't knows. People don't usually talk about don't knows in surveys, but in this case, it's pretty interesting because they're low. They're like 1%, 2%, 3%. And that suggests that people were able to understand these principles, that they were able to, make something out of it. Because sometimes when we've done things like this, the don't knows can be 12%, 15%, or higher. And that's when people are dealing with, they're reading things that are ambiguous or they don't quite get it. So overall, this is a good sign, resonates, fairly clear. Priorities. This looks similar, but it was a totally different type of question. So here, we weren't asking people to rate the importance of these things. We were trading them off. So it's called forced choice paired trade-off. And what it means is that each one of these potential priorities was positioned against one other one. So for each participant, they were given 5 pairs. And they were asked, okay, of these 2, which one should have the most priority? A versus D, C versus F, D versus B. And what you have on the right, so these percentages, is the number of times that this priority was selected as more important. So if we use a sports analogy, you would have a season and every team plays every team an equal amount of times, and at the end of the season, here is the percentage of games they won. So that's one way of looking at it. The other thing that's worth noting is that each of these priorities was went 1,100 times, was tested 1,100 times. So this is quite robust. A couple of things to note, with the exception at the bottom here, where we have minimizing cost to electricity ratepayers, which is consistent with what I just showed you. So putting aside that at 27%, which is quite low, the rest from 40% to 64%, it's sort of quite bunched up. There's not a lot of difference there, which suggests that it was pretty tough for people to make choices. The other thing that we want to notice is the ones that are at the top. So we've got sort of a top tier, which is locating facilities away from the Great Lakes, away from population centers. Then you've got some mid-tier priorities all around the 50%. And then you've got the ones at the bottom. So something specifically that I want to note, look at minimizing the transportation of radioactive waste. That's 51%. And then you've got having as few radioactive waste management facilities as possible. So having one facility or having a centralized approach would require more transportation. So here you see the tension between transportation and whether one is gonna, or whether it's best to have a centralized or a decentralized approach. And here, by a little bit, minimizing transportation is a bit of a higher priority. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. So we've got potential strategy parameters, and here we're getting into more specific things. So we use scenario-based questions, 3 of them, to try to understand a couple of things. What do people's what we could call informed common sense tells them about the relative merits of potential broad approaches to the long-term management of low and intermediate radioactive waste? And more importantly, for what we're trying to do, is how do people look at the issues? How do they make trade-offs? And we're able to understand that because we asked an open-ended question. So we presented a scenario, a choice, people made a choice, and then we said, okay, given your choice, why? Why this? And people wrote their comments, and we got literally thousands of comments because you had 1,600 people responding. And when you put them all together across the 3 questions, it's 6 times 1,600. So the issues that we looked at are pretty basic. So the first set is status quo, sort of above ground, basically continuing what is being done now versus permanent disposal. The second was this idea of, should we have a centralized approach with a single facility, or is it better to have a decentralized approach with multiple facilities closer to where the waste is being produced? And then we had a scenario about implementation, basically who should be doing what. Before I show you that, I wanted to show you this quickly. This is from another set of questions. I'm not showing you all of the results because we don't have time, but I wanted to show you this. So this is the results of what we call an agree-disagree question. So the statement is, I'm just as concerned about the hazards of low-level radioactive waste as I am of intermediate-level radioactive waste. And then it's a 7-point scale. And this time I'm showing you the full scale, including the don't know. So the who agree with that is 59%. Those who disagree is 25%. So the point here is that despite the fact that we provided some fact-based information, including pretty much a whole video that talked about the differences between low and intermediate level wastes, at this point, when you ask people about it, they're like, I'm just as concerned about both. So that, that gives you some context about how people think about this. So now let's get into some of these scenarios here. So there's a lot on here. I'll walk you through it. So first of all, the issue here is continued surface storage, basically doing what we're doing because it works and it's safe, so you could, versus specifically designed facilities, sort of longer term approach. We asked separate questions for low-level radioactive waste and for intermediate-level radioactive waste. The concepts are the same. The wording is a little bit different to reflect the different types of waste. So on the left-hand side, you have the results for low-level, and on the right-hand side, you've got intermediate-level waste. People were asked to pick. So they had a choice. It's not rating. It's pick one. Which one do you think is best? So they have their options. So putting it in a specially designed facility, pretty much status quo, but you're going to have to, look after it for a while. And then they also had a choice, but either way is fine. As long as it meets federal and international safety regulations, it's fine. You guys decide. And so let's see what we have. So with respect to low-level waste, the plurality actually picks either way is fine. And relatively few people are saying, well, let's just keep doing what we're doing. Let's just keep it on the surface and keep monitoring. When we go to intermediate level waste, it's different. You have fewer people saying either approach is fine, and those people tend to go, it seems, because it's like 10% for the other one. So it's significantly higher for a sort of long-term solution based on some kind of repository, okay? So that's what we see here. Now, this one is the centralized versus decentralized. Again, it's the same setup. You got low level on one side, intermediate level on the other side with slightly different wording. But the point here is, okay, if one were to do this, does it make more sense to have several of these, or does it make more sense to sort of put it all in one place and have the waste owners share this? When it comes to low level, you've got a plurality saying that it should be, you should have multiple facilities close to where the waste is being produced. That may surprise people. It did surprise me, but there's an explanation for it. And then you've got the single facility at 20%, and then either approach is fine. When you look at intermediate level, it's pretty divided, 34, 25, 33. So there's some openness there. And which one, when building a separate long-term management facility versus building only one. So there's, consistent with what I was showing you before when we looked at priorities, transportation versus minimizing the number of facilities, with reducing transportation winning out a little bit as a higher priority. We see that reflected in here as well. Now, in terms of implementation, we asked a couple of questions about that, but I want to show you this one. So here, it's the same construct again, same sort of question, but this time we said, okay, thinking about implementation, would it be better to create a separate organization to do this, or would it be best to allow each waste owner to implement sort of their part of the strategy? And what you have here is 56%, a majority saying, we think it would be better to have a separate organization. Now, why is that? I'm going to talk about that in a second, because we had those follow-up questions, and it was a good idea to have those follow-up questions because we got a lot out of it in terms of the why. And in this case, the separate organization, essentially from the public's perspective, prevents a diffusion of things that are important to people. So accountability, transparency, monitoring. The idea being that if you have one organization rather than many, it's going to be easier to do these things, right? It's going to be more transparent. There's going to be more focus as opposed to having a number of different players. So now, a couple of more things. Considerations for strategy design. So this is basically what came out of our analysis of those follow-up open-ended questions to those sets of questions that I just showed you. So the centralized versus decentralized, sort of a status quo versus permanent solution. This is what people wrote about. So there are thousands of comments. So when you put them together, so this is what they wrote about collectively. Not everybody wrote about all of this stuff, but when you put it together, this is what people said. And I've clustered them into four, the lens, the trade-off, but I could have done it differently. The point is to focus on the right-hand side. And the way to read this is people, is to what extent, so that when people are considering an approach, this or that, this versus that, this way versus that way, they say to themselves, well, to what extent will this approach minimize the impact on the environment, keep the facilities away from population centers, reduce transportation, encourage vigilance, promote transparency? So this is what they were writing about. So I prefer this because of that. I prefer this option because I think it's going to be more successful at doing these things, which I think are important. So some people emphasize the environment. Some people emphasize transparency and so on. But when you put them together, this is what you get. Now, this is a nice list, but there's some tension here, of course, and I just want to talk a little bit about that. So there's tension between, for example, transportation and some of these other issues. So for a lot of people, a centralized approach, when they were writing about that, those who picked that, they said, well, you know, having one facility allows the players to concentrate their efforts. So we're probably going to get a better design, a better build than if we have to build many of these things. We can all focus, right? So we put all our heads together. The other thing that it allows you to do is if you're building one, you can put it away from population centers. And also if you have one, it might be easier to monitor. So that's how people tend to talk about that. On the other side of the equation, those that said, you know, I think it's better to have a decentralized approach. Let's keep the waste close to where it's being produced. Well, they were concerned, or their issue is transportation. So if they see minimizing transportation as the key to ensuring safety, then they will say, well, you know, we should reduce transportation, and so that'll make it safer. And then there are other consideration as well, such as response. So first responders, what happens if something goes wrong? Well, if you put it in an isolated area, that's great. Maybe it's away from water, it's certainly away from population centers, but what happens if something goes wrong? Who is going to respond? So these are all the things that people think about when they're considering these things. And again, it's important to note that people aren't wedded to these things. They're prefacing their comments often with caveats. It's just based on what I know, and I'm no expert, but it sounds to me like this might be the way to go. A couple of other things I want to note. The vigilance, I've talked a little bit about this already, but vigilance was a big one. And this is where having a centralized approach and also having a separate organization, that is, vigilance is seen as the strengths of these approaches. So having fewer people involved, having one separate organization is going to help with transparency, is going to help with monitoring, so on and so forth. The last thing I want to mention on this slide is in the other consideration, reduce impacts on future generations. So people say, yeah, you know, we do have a moral responsibility to do this. So our generation and the generation before us that created a lot of this, we should deal with it. It's not good to saddle future generations. But what's new, because we've been doing this sort of research for a few years, but for the first time, there's this other aspect, which is capacity. So some people were writing about, you know, we can't assume that future generations are going to be in as good a position as we are. And maybe this has to do with, you know, COVID and how people perceive the world. But, you know, for the first time, I've noticed people saying, you know, progress is not linear. Things might be worse off. You know, 300 years is a long time. 20 years is a long time. So I just thought that was interesting from a sociological perspective. So we're almost done. I want to show you some verbatim quotes because there's so much qualitative data in here. So we have to use words. I can't show you numbers. So I picked out some of these quotes. We won't read them all, but I want to read the first one because it really crystallizes some things. This is what people wrote. So this is one person. I wish I knew more about how nuclear waste was transported to waste facilities, but taking that out of the equation, I think it's better to have one centralized facility created from the ground up to exceed international standards and maintained at that level. Let's look at this other one. Because storing it on the surface in a proper facilities allow careful monitoring and easier access if needed. Storage underground leads to saying out of sight, out of mind. So the out of sight, out of mind, and the sweeping under the rug, that came up a few times. I won't bother with these others. You can read them quickly. Last section here is what are the implications of all this as we move forward? Because this survey was a first kick at the can, and we need to build from it and so on. So what comes out of it? So in terms of the guiding principles, I think, you know, if I can say that, that we've got something to work with here. We've got a good foundation just based on the results. Moving forward, I mean, we've got 11 right now. Do we want to merge some of these? Is anything missing? So that's one question that we would have asked had we had room, but we couldn't ask everything. So, but in a face-to-face session and going forward, that's probably something that we would want to know. Is anything missing? Can we refine the wording? And then the understanding is, well, what do people interpret this to mean? So they think they've got a clear understanding of it, but what does that mean? So that when you say, well, we need to be transparent or we need to engage with communities, well, what does that mean? So it's good to have a conversation about that. Anticipated questions, we talked about some of these at the beginning. So if I were to do a face-to-face session with people, I'd be ready to sort of answer these questions or maybe have this information. What is the future of nuclear? While we're talking about it, what is the future? What about alternatives and transportation? I think that's pretty obvious why it might be a good idea to talk about that. And then people do ask questions about siting. So one should be prepared to talk about that. The last thing I'm going to show you is this aspect here. And I think ultimately, of course, when we're talking about this sort of stuff with science and technology, ultimately, and I think we're seeing this with the COVID vaccines, acceptance is going to be based on a certain amount of faith and trust, right? But people need to have a certain amount of information to at least be able to have some trust. And part of that is who's doing what? What is the division of labor between the players, and who are the players? Who's government? Who's private sector? And it's complicated for people, right? Because what's a crown corporation? What's an agency? What is the relationship between, you know, Bruce Power and OPG, and like, how does all this stuff work? And we provided information about that in the survey, but in reading some of the open-ended questions, it's hard for people to grasp. Similarly is the regulatory framework. That's important to people, but it's challenging because there's a whole bunch of different regulators involved. There's the IAEA, there's the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, there's different federal departments, there's provinces, there's even municipalities where first responders are concerned. And that's counterintuitive to people because they want to know, well, who is in charge? And it's like, it's more complicated than that. So these things are important, but they're a challenge. So I'll leave you with that.
So I'll already answer one of the questions that has come up, which is, will we have access to these slides or the report? And the answer is yes and yes. So that information will be posted on the Integrated Strategy website at radwasteplanning.ca in April. So if you haven't already done so, go there, sign up for alerts, and we'll let you know when it gets posted. So I already have a few questions have come in. So I'm glad all of you have found where the Engage tab is. So that's great. And we only have time for short questions and answer period. The first question, Pat, for you is, how do opinions vary by region?
That is a good question. In this case, they don't vary much at all. I'm trying to think back. There are some, I would say they are quite consistent. In terms of specifics, I know for Northern Ontario, when we looked at Northern Ontario, because we oversampled there, so of course we're going to look, they tended to provide higher priority on most issues. So they rated things higher. That's really the only thing that comes to mind. Most of the differences were by gender and a little bit by age, but it's generally uniform.
And the other question is probably more for me, which is, what does the feedback inform us on how existing projects are implemented, as the feedback indicates lowest importance scale? And so what I'll I'll provide is, obviously we're making this research available to everyone, and we're going to really take it into account with the integrated strategy work that we're doing for developing future plans. And I also wanted to note that with respect to the principles that Pat talked about, and he asked some questions today to challenge you about those principles, our breakout session this afternoon will be focused on those principles. So you'll have an opportunity to tell us whether we missed anything. All right. Did your sample include Indigenous populations? The use of traditional knowledge holders regarding the health of lands is important.
We did, but we didn't oversample for it. So according to Statistics Canada, I believe the people who identify as Indigenous, I believe it's 4% of the population. So that's roughly what we would have gotten as part of the sample, but we didn't oversample for it. Yeah.
We will also, like, as we mentioned at the start of the summit, this is like our first engagement activity. So we do have plans to engage more deeply with Indigenous peoples. So there will be opportunities for them to provide further input as we go forward, as well as to the broader Canadian public. So last question for today, Pat. Do the open-ended comments shed light on why costs are a lower priority in the forest pair choices?
Yes. It's because people don't want to do or to countenance anything that would possibly lessen the safety and security of the design and the implementation. So while they realize, and they will even ask questions about cost, like how much would this, or this probably less expensive, they don't want that to be a guide. They especially don't want sort of profit to be a guide. So they're concerned about that. We've seen that as past research as well. So it's just because it's about safety, right? It'd be the same thing if you were to ask about food safety or water safety. Like, should cost be a factor? Not really.
We did get one more quick question. I don't know if you're able to address it in like a minute or less, Pat. Was there any common themes as to why people suggested that the location of the site should be away from the Great Lakes?
Well, because water is always emotional, first of all, with people. And people do recognize that as a source of drinking water, and it just sounds calamitous to people if something were to happen. But it's like it's water in general, but the Great Lakes is sort of an easy to relate to symbol of the sanctity and the importance of water. So, but I mean, how far is away from the Great Lakes? What is that? Like, we didn't ask that. Is that like 20 kilometers? Is that 200 kilometers? So.
Well, thank you very much, Pat. We did get one more question about whether or not our sample included existing host communities. We didn't sample I believe the sample was not selected that way to intentionally target those communities, but we aim to get a broad spectrum of Canadian perspectives. So thank you again, Pat. As I mentioned, his presentation is already up on our website, radwasteplanning.ca.